everyone. My name is John. I work in visitor services here at the museum, and I just want to welcome everyone on behalf of the Harvard Art Museums to this whole family student guide tour this evening. We are going to get started in just a second, but before we do that, I thought I would just go over some quick Zoom logistics before we get started. I think everyone probably realizes that we are in the webinar format this evening. That means your video is turned off and your audio is muted. But this is an interactive tour. And the way that we are going to interact this evening is through the chat feature, which is located on the bottom taskbar in Zoom. If you click on that, you'll notice that there is a drop-down menu. You should have two options. You want to make sure and click on everyone. That way, if you have a comment or a question, everyone will be able to see it. It makes for a more enjoyable tour. Jacqueline will have lots of questions for us, and any comments that we want to make, we put in the chat. And now that people have the chat feature open, I am always interested to know where people are tuning in from. I happen to be in relatively cold Jamaica Plain this evening. If you feel so inclined, you can put in the chat where you are visiting from. Welcome. So we got people from all over. Welcome. And then someone asked if this would be available to watch later. That is a good question. I am not sure. If it is, it will be posted on the Harvard Art Museum's YouTube page or Vimeo page. And I can put a link to that a little bit later, maybe after the tour. Welcome, welcome. So we have pretty good group. So I just want to welcome everyone, and I think that we can get started. I don't think we have to delay any further. So I'd just like to turn it over to Jacqueline, and we can start to get ready for the tour.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jacqueline. I am a Ho family student guide at the Harvard Art Museums. I'm a junior in the college from St. Louis, Missouri, concentrating in social studies with a focus field of study in Native American sovereignty and identity. I'm a proud member of the Pueblo tribe. As a Native student here at Harvard, I'm really excited to present this tour that I've been working to put together titled "This Land is Whose Land?" If we were in person at the Harvard Art Museums, this is where we would be standing. This is our beautiful courtyard. Just trying to make you all feel as if we're there. In this tour, I will contrast settler colonial imaginations of the American West with the experiences and realities portrayed by three Native American photographers in the Art Museum's collections: Wendy Red Star, Will Wilson, and Zig Jackson. Before we dive into the art, however, I'm going to turn it over to Jason Packnow, Community Coordinator of the Harvard University Native American Program. He'll provide a bit more context to Harvard's relationship with the Native community on campus and beyond.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Dashkaja Haninidosh. My name is Jason Packnow, and I'm here representing the Harvard University Native American Program, otherwise known as HUNAP. And as is customary in many of our gatherings at HUNAP, we usually begin with prayer, or in this instance, we're going to pause to recognize the relationships that we seek to build with one another. HUNAP over the past couple of months has deliberately moved to cultivate a relationship with the Massachusetts people directly. And the acknowledgement that I'm going to read is a direct result of those efforts. It's about creating relationships. It's about creating bonds. It's not always easy. Sometimes it's messy, but it's something that has to be done. And that's how we sort of move about in this world and space. And so I'm going to read to you the acknowledgement of land and people as created by both the Massachusetts tribe in collaboration with HUNAP. Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. And again, I just want to share just a very quick spiel about HUNAP. We are a organization or office that promotes the scholarly engagement of all Native and Indigenous issues at Harvard, while also elevating the presence and visibility of our community on campus. You can learn more by visiting our website, www.hunap.harvard.edu. And tonight, we support one of our own students, Jacqueline, and I would like to personally thank give you an extend a sincere thanks to you and to the whole Family Student Guide program for this evening's event. This land is whose land, and the pieces you will see tonight, as Jacqueline has shared with me prior, resonate deeply with me. I am a citizen of the Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara Nation from North Dakota, and our homelands were flooded and our entire nation removed and displaced in the 1950s. It forever changed the beauty of the land, and it severed our connection to our way of life that at one point was the epitome of the Great Plains. I'm also from the pueblos of Laguna and Jemez in New Mexico. My Laguna grandfather worked for a short time in uranium mines and was a cog in the very institution and industrialization and decimation of our homelands. These lived experiences remind me that when we say whose land, the answer is personal, sometimes raw, and extremely relevant to our lives here in 2021. So I thank you for joining us tonight, and I'll turn the time back over to Jacqueline.
Thank you so much for that, Jason. Like Jason said, if you guys have any more questions about the Harvard University Native American program, I encourage you to visit the website here on the screen, hunap.harvard.edu. I would also like to direct you to our Native American program partnership with the Hope Family Student Guides. So a couple of the guides created a digital collection of some of the works at the museums by Native American artists. You can find that link also in the chat. So throughout this tour, I'll be asking a few questions of all of you. You guys have already been really active in the chat, which is awesome. So continue to keep that up, please. It makes this tour a bit more exciting when I get some input from all of you. So don't be shy when I ask the questions. There's no right or wrong answer. I just want to get the conversation flowing a little bit. So on to the art. On your screen is an oil on linen painting by Albert Bierstadt titled Rocky Mountains, Lander's Peak, painted in 1863. This was one of the paintings that I was most drawn to when I first visited the Harvard Art Museums because of just how grandiose it is. I know that much of the experience of viewing this piece is lost in the virtual format, so I just want to give you all an understanding of just how large this painting is. In its very ornate frame, which you can't see in this image on the screen, the painting stands just shy of 5 feet tall and 4 feet wide. It isn't even the largest of Bierstadt's paintings from this Rocky Mountain series. Another one that he painted from this series extends as long as 10 feet and as tall as 6 feet. So very intentionally so, standing before this painting makes a viewer feel extremely small. Before diving into a bit of the context of this painting though, I would love to hear from all of you. What element of this painting stands out the most to you? It can be something small, something big. Any thoughts that you have, just toss them in the chat. I'll give you guys. Awesome, yeah, so it seems like we are pretty much on the same page. I see some comments about the lighting, the clouds, the trees. Yeah, so I agree. The first thing that I was initially drawn to when I saw this painting was the use of lighting. I will get back to this in a couple minutes. In the meantime, I encourage you all to think about exactly what this lighting reminds you of, what it makes you think of, and I'll get back to it in a little bit. In the meantime, however, I'm going to provide a little bit of historical context on this painting, which will allow you, I think, to better understand it. Albert Bierstadt was a German-American painter known for his grandiose landscapes of the American West. In 1859, Bierstadt traveled on an expedition to the Rocky Mountain Range in Wyoming, led by Colonel Frederick Lander. Upon his return from this expedition, Bierstadt moved his studio to New York and transformed the sketches and stereographic images collected during this journey into large landscape paintings like the ones you see on this screen. Albert Bierstadt is known for painting in the style of the German Dusseldorf school, which is characterized by good composition and fine, fanciful details. As Bierstadt became increasingly famous for his landscapes, he was identified as one of the painters of the Hudson River School. The school was characterized by their affinity for painting idealized, very dramatic, naturalistic landscapes. Interestingly, though, this school fell completely out of fashion by the end of the 1800s as American taste in art began to shift away from such monumental aesthetics like this painting. In turning back to this painting, however, like we mentioned earlier, one can't help but feel drawn or enticed by Bierstadt's emphasis on light. The foreground of this painting is notably darker than the rest of it. The streams of light through the clouds draw the viewer's eyes to the Edenic oasis that he places in the middle ground of this painting. which here is a bit of a closer look at it. It allows you just to get a bit of a better impression at the detail of his brushwork. Bierstadt also makes interesting use of scale in this painting, which you might not have initially noticed. In the foreground, he has placed a bear that appears to be consuming a deer or another kind of animal. These work together to make it pretty clear that this landscape that he is depicting is massive, and that it's just big. And so the painting with it, though, does carry religious undertones with this use of light. The shift from dark foreground to well-lit background with the celestial light streaming through the clouds can be read as representing the positive moral implications of exploring and settling the West. By representing the West as an area divinely protected, again, bathed in this pool of celestial light, this painting very much upholds and encourages the doctrine of manifest destiny, which asserted that westward expansion was both necessary and inevitable. Absent from this painting are humans, notably the Native American tribes that the expedition group encountered along their journey, namely the Eastern Shoshone people who lived and continue to live in this region of Wyoming, which is the Wind River Mountain Range. I would like to point out that Albert Bierstadt placed a certain entrepreneurial emphasis on his paintings. He sought to represent the West in a way that was enticing, but above all marketable at auction. So he made a lot of money from his paintings. In doing so, it's essential to note that many of Bierstadt's paintings are composite images that synthesize multiple points of view, which he might have seen along his journey. So in other words, the perspective from which you are viewing this Western landscape isn't necessarily a perspective that Bierstadt himself actually saw. Although the painting contains certain claims to realism with the detail of the brushwork, the image that it depicts is an imagined space. In a 1991 New York Times review, Michael Brenson writes of Bierstadt's art, Bierstadt was the first painter to realize the degree to which the West could be artistically exploited. Americans were eager to know what the West was like and whether it could be won. In creating this composite landscape, his own imaginative depiction of the environment, one that notably excludes the Eastern Shoshone people, Bierstadt markets westward expansion into the lands of the very tribes that he erases. This painting, although aesthetically beautiful, ultimately encourages the problematic providential national identity that spurred westward expansion. So with that, I'm very excited to transition to a discussion of an imagined space of the West by an Apsáalooke Crow photographer, Wendy Red Star. This photograph is titled Indian Summer, taken in 2006. This is one of my favorite photographs, but before we get into it, I'm curious to hear from all of you. What elements of this image are the most unusual to you or the most unsettling? If you didn't participate the first time, feel free to this time. Would love to know your thoughts. Awesome, yeah. Amazing. So yeah, so you guys are all, many of you are kind of on the right track. Something about this is incredibly artificial. To me, right, there's a question of what's real and what's fake exactly. To me, I was initially very drawn to the fact that there's an evident glare on the backdrop and the fact that you can still see the seams in the backdrop. But a lot of you are exactly on that same page. So in case it was not clear due to the virtual viewing of this photograph, everything in this image is artificial except for Wendy Red Star herself, who sits at the center. From the fake backdrop to the cut out deer, to the astroturf grass, the fake flowers, Wendy Red Star has inserted herself into an intentionally imagined and artificial space. She plays with the realism that is usually lent by photography by depicting the West as a space in which she is the only real element. This discussion of faux realism stands in interesting contrast with the faux realism lent by Bierstadt to his own imagined space through painting. If this photograph reminds you at all of Native American dioramas you may have seen in natural history museums, which I saw, I think, a couple comments of that, well, that is the point of this image. Wendy Red Star grew up on the Crow Reservation in Montana. She eventually attended graduate school at UCLA, and while in Los Angeles, she was struck with a bout of homesickness. So in this, she turned to the Natural History Museum because she knew she'd be able to find Crow objects that would remind her of her home and her people. Wendy Red Star describes, however, that she was taken aback by the Native American displays at this museum being placed in such close proximity to the displays about dinosaurs. She felt that these representations of Native people were putting them into the past and relegating them to a status of a history long gone. Wendy Red Star then was inspired to put together this project in which she essentially recreates the museum dioramas and places herself within them. This photograph is intended to be very ironic. So drawing your attention to Wendy Red Star herself more closely, you can see that she dons an elk tooth dress, which is a traditional piece of attire in the Apsáalooke culture. Historically, the elk teeth served as a status symbol of sorts for the person wearing the dress, indicating their connection to skilled hunters or tradesmen, as there were only 2 of these type of teeth per elk. So if this were a museum diorama, this dress would be merely an ethnographic artifact, but Wendy donned this traditional dress to communicate that this apparent artifact carries living meaning still today. So yes, someone asked a question. So this is her actually posed in front of a backdrop. So it's not photoshopped. Those things are all around her. They're just fake. You may have noticed also how powerful yet detached Wendy Red Star's gaze is. This element of detachment in her gaze, I think, tricks the viewers into distancing themselves from Red Star and perceiving her as a cohesive element of this piece. When again, the point of this piece is to challenge the stereotypical displays of Native Americans that she's playing into. Ultimately, in gathering the materials to compile her own imagined composite landscape of the West, Wendy Red Star seeks to challenge the distance with which Native peoples have long been perceived, and reminds your viewers that Natives are here, that we are alive, and that our various cultures continue to thrive. Wendy Red Star stakes claim over this imagined space to empower herself and all Natives. This photograph, Indian Summer, also exists as a larger series, which you can see here. I'll give you guys a couple of minutes just to take a look. I know that they are pretty small, so if you want a better look at them, I encourage you to visit our website as well, because you can see them a little bit larger on your screens. So if you guys had a chance to look at that, they also correspond to the other seasons. So as you can see, we talked about Indian Summer at the bottom, but she has 3 other seasons as well. So again, I encourage you guys to take a closer look at them. So transitioning from the discussion of imagination to one of reality, the next photograph I'll be sharing with you is one by Diné photographer Will Wilson. So before I go any further, can anyone tell me exactly what we're looking at or where we are? Awesome, yeah. So someone pointed out Monument Valley, someone said waste storage, mining, all of those are correct. This photo was taken by Will Wilson using drone technology over Navajo Nation. Navajo Nation extends into areas of Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, covering over 27,000 square miles of land. It's the largest area of land retained by a Native American tribe, and it is larger than 10 of the 50 states. Specifically, this photograph depicts the Mexican hat disposal cell. Here is a brief historical context, though, to understanding exactly what that is. So from 1944 to 1986, 30 million tons of uranium ore were extracted from Navajo lands. Navajo land was initially opened up for this mining to support the Manhattan Project, but at the conclusion of the Cold War, all of these mines were abandoned. As it stands today, there exist 500 abandoned uranium mines on Navajo Nation. The particular site depicted in the photo is circled near the top of this map of the other sites in Navajo Nation. This one is in southern Utah, like I mentioned before. These abandoned sites pose substantial health hazards to the surrounding population. Health effects of this on Navajo Nation include increased rates of lung cancer, bone cancer, and impaired kidney functioning, all from exposure to radioactive material and airborne particles in drinking water. Cancer rates doubled in Navajo Nation between 1970 and 1990, and cancer today is the second leading cause of death among the Navajo people. The site depicted in this image is the Mexican hat disposal site, where uranium processing mill operated between 1957 and 1970. Once the mill closed, this became a disposal site where 4.4 million dry tons of radioactive tailings have been stabilized. These tailings are stabilized essentially by being capped with clay and rock and being left. This site stands just 1.5 miles away from the town Mexican Hat, Utah, and 1 mile away from the San Juan River. Due to the presence of this hazardous waste, the natural water quality near the site is unsafe for human consumption. So now, in turning back to the photo itself, like I mentioned before, this photo was taken using drone technology from 1,000 feet in the air. Will Wilson asserts that drone photography allows viewers to bear witness to these places and understand the geographical dynamics of the site. He views this photography as a tool of truth-telling. So in contrast to what we've discussed so far, this is not an imagined space, this is a reality. I would also like to point out the size of this photograph. It's currently hanging in the Devour the Land exhibition that's open in the Harvard Art Museums until mid-January. It's about 2 feet tall and 3.5 feet wide. It's imposing and it's intimidating. And when you look at this image up close, it becomes slightly disorienting. So the longer you look, the more surreal it seems to get. So now just to point out the specific details of the photo, someone already pointed this out, but on the horizon, you can see Monument Valley in Utah, which is a popular tourist and travel destination. But I'd also like to turn our attention to the disposal site itself. What is striking to me when zooming in on this photograph is the contrast between the man-made nature of the disposal cell with the natural contours of the earth that surrounds it. The disposal site is clearly unnatural. It represents and is the source of the damage that man can inflict to earth. However, it sits in this vista as if somehow supposed to eventually become naturalized, as if this damage is supposed to eventually be accepted as a given element of the land on which the Navajo people live. There's also a contrast between the increased vantage point that a drone photo such as this lends the viewer and the contamination that ultimately exists out of view of what any eye can see. The damage is invisible and it's insidious despite any vantage point lent to the viewer. This photograph also lends itself to a broader discussion about the history of extraction on Native American lands. The extraction equation requires two things: one, that resources exist, and two, that resources exist on vulnerable lands. Native lands have long been the targets of extraction. This photo even complicates the conversation about how to rectify this history of extraction, though, by illuminating the fact that the burden of fixing is unequal. These disposal sites were intended to bear the costs of the uranium extraction, yet they still leave the Navajo people the most vulnerable. This is the reality communicated by this image. This photo exists as a part of a larger project being compiled by Will Wilson, titled Connecting the Dots. He describes this project as exploring what contemporary Indigenous cartography would look like. And he writes that this project will, quote, illustrate problems and empower communities to creatively imagine and define solutions, retelling stories of the land by those most affected by the false logic of extraction, unquote. Through this project, Will Wilson complicates representations of the grandeur of the West by shedding visibility onto the harm inflicted against the Navajo Nation that would otherwise have remained invisible or would have at least gone unaddressed. So with that, the final photograph that I'll be transitioning to talk about is this one by Zig Jackson. First of all, can anyone tell me where we are in this photo? Amazing. Yeah, so everyone's right. We are in San Francisco at the Golden Gate Bridge. This photo, here's the label, kind of spoiled the answer. So Zig Jackson is Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, and was raised on the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota. In 2005, he became the first Native American photographer to have his work collected by the Library of Congress. And this year, he became the first Native American photographer to receive a Guggenheim Fellowship in photography. This photo is a part of a series called Entering Zig's Indian Reservation from 1997. You may not have initially noticed from this, but the sign in the middle is Zig's addition to the landscape. For this photo series, Zig Jackson transported this sign around various areas of San Francisco and took photos along the way. The sign reads, which it's hard to tell through the screen, Entering Zig's Indian Reservation. And then the smaller sign reads, no pictures, no hunting, no air traffic, New Agers prohibited without permission from the Tribal Council. This photo in particular, which also hangs in the Devour the Land exhibition, so another plug to come visit the museums and see that, places Zig Jackson defiantly marching before one of the most recognizable man-made pieces of infrastructure in the United States, the Golden Gate Bridge. What is interesting about this image is that most of the natural landscape obscures the bridge. This creates an interesting dialogue with the history of westward expansion, which saw the creation of infrastructure obscuring the natural landscape. So in a way, this photo functions as a reversal. His use of a road sign is a curious detail. Road signs have long been used to claim space, but their existence is also indicative of the expansion and eventual systematization of settlement of lands that once belonged solely to Native Americans. I would also like to draw your attention to the center of the photograph, where the bridge, the tree, and the sign are stacked, putting notions of ownership, nature, and infrastructure in relation and into tension with each other. You might also notice that Zig Jackson is not alone in the image. On his website, Zig Jackson displays this photo with the caption, "I have the Golden Gate Bridge on my reservation. I have to do something about these tourists." Through this photo series, Zig Jackson reclaims land for himself and for all Native Americans, pointing out the historic dispossession of Native lands. He uses this project to state claims to pieces of land that definitively do not belong to him, recreating and therefore reclaiming the history of westward expansion and settlement, and lending agency to Native Americans in the recreation of that history. These photographs allow Zig Jackson to represent an imagined space in which Native Americans can exercise full autonomy and dictate the terms of their sovereignty. But this photo leaves me with one question. What if we lived in a world where an image like this didn't have to be playful art, but was in fact a lived reality? So with that, that brings me to the end of my tour. Again, the artists that I spoke about were Wendy Red Star, Will Wilson, and Zig Jackson. If you guys want to see these images clearer or just higher quality than through a PowerPoint, I encourage you again to visit the Harvard Art Museum's website. Also, while you're at it, do visit the special collection that we've put together through the Ho Family Student Guides. These discussions of Native identity, environmental justice, and land ownership are incredibly relevant and should hold saliency not only this month, but always. I hope that you all could learn something during this tour, and I know I learned a ton by putting it together, but I hope that you can carry anything that you learned into the rest of this month and beyond. So with that, have a great evening. Happy Native American Heritage Month, and I'm going to turn it back over to John.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. If anyone, we are a little bit tight on time, but if anyone has any final questions or comments that they would like to make, please just throw them in the chat. Jacqueline would be happy to answer. And while people may be thinking of a question, I will just let everyone know that student guide tours are every Thursday at 8 o'clock. Next Thursday is a holiday, so then the following tour would be on the 18th. I will put this in the chat at the moment. Paul is going to present on the theme, the art of the everyday. So please join us for that. And it looks like we have a couple of questions, so we'll turn it back.
Yeah, I will ask about some of these. What's the most surprising thing I learned when putting together this tour? Definitely diving into the research about the uranium disposal sites on Navajo Nation. I learned a lot, and it was extremely, it was just very eye-opening, thought-provoking, and also just very upsetting to learn this happens and that this is real and this is current. So that was the most surprising thing I learned. What pueblos am I from? My family is from Jemez, Laguna, and San Felipe. And let's see, there are so many. Let's see. Are you planning to have more tours of Native art? Yes, I would love to. I would love to keep giving this tour. This was compiled just for Native American Heritage Month, but I would be interested in giving more tours about it, or however that looks in the future. I would also love to turn this into an in-person tour eventually. But yeah, it just depends on which works are on display in the museum. So it's kind of ultimately not up to me, but it would be great. I'm kind of reading these incredibly. Oh, are there any other pieces you considered including? Well, yeah, if I had my way, I would have talked about a lot of the other pieces in the collections. Namely, we have another photograph by Zig Jackson and more photographs by Wendy Red Star. I love both of those photographers. Will Wilson, we also have another image by him that's really powerful. So if I had my way, I would have included just more art by these artists, because I think they're incredible and I think that they deserve plenty of airtime, especially from the Harvard Art Museums. This is my brother who asked, where else has Zig Jackson photographed himself? Hey, Josh. He's done a lot of work around San Francisco. However, he also has a really interesting project from, I believe, right before the Entering Zig's Indian Reservation project, where it was called Indian Photographing Tourist Photographing Indian, where he essentially took photos of tourists taking photos of Native Americans on reservations during powwows or feast days, stuff like that. So I encourage you to Google that because it's incredibly fascinating. I became a huge fan of his work, especially by learning that. And yeah, I mean, there are, I think, other questions that I'm sure I'm skipping, but
that's okay. We're actually running a little tight on time. But
yeah.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Excellent tour. Jason, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. We won't keep you any longer this evening. I just want to thank you again on behalf of the Harvard Art Museums. And please join us again 8 o'clock on the 18th for Paul's tour, The Art of the Everyday. So with that, I hope everyone has a good evening and we hope to see you soon. Thank you again.